It's time for
On the victory home front.
With Jamie. If Hollywood taught us anything about the 1940s, it's that women apparently vacuumed in pearls, heels, and perfect lipstick. But actual American women, they were wearing something else. A house dress. Hello to all the Rosies and Homefront Joes, and welcome back to On the Victory Homefront. Today, we are going to be talking about the hardest working dress in wartime America. The house dress. The wartime house dress was one of the most common forms of women's everyday clothing in the U.S. during the 1930s and the 1940s. Yet, it appears far less often in surviving photographs in formal wear, uniforms, or best clothing. Because most family photography of the era really centered on holidays, weddings, military portraits, and special occasions, the ordinary domestic clothing was less frequently documented. I'm not saying it wasn't. There are pictures, but it wasn't as common to take pictures in your everyday workwear as it was when you were dressed nice. And so the absence from photographs can make modern people maybe underestimate how common the house dress really was. So, what was a house dress? Well, it was a practical garment intended primarily for domestic work and daily household life. And a lot of the common features included washable cotton fabric, simple construction, short sleeves, a front button or a wrap closure, loose, comfortable cuts, and at least one functional pocket. Unlike formal dresses, house dresses prioritized the ease of movement, durability, affordability, and ease of laundering. Many were purchased ready-made through department stores like the one I'm wearing today, and you could also purchase them from mail-order catalogs such as Sears and Montgomery Ward, while others were home sewn using commercial sewing patterns. And house dresses were incredibly common. They were daily workwear for millions of women. Yes, I am going to go out and put that statement out that it was for millions of women. And most women owned several. They weren't fashion in the glamorous sense, they were tools. And so, why were they so important? Well, in the 1940s, many American women spent large portions of the day performing physical, demanding domestic labor. They were cooking from scratch, they were doing laundry, cleaning, childcare, gardening, canning food, ration shopping, although you wouldn't wear your house dress out and about, sewing and mending. The house dress functioned as practical work clothing for those tasks. It saved your everyday clothing, your nicer clothing, from the domestic work of possible stains, tears, or anything that may come along those lines. And so rather than being considered fashionable public attire, house dresses were generally viewed as informal home garments. And many women would change into nicer clothing before going downtown, attending church, receiving guests, or having photographs taken. Now, during World War II, we did have fashion ration restrictions, and the U.S. government introduced restrictions on civilian clothing production through War Production Board Regulation L-85. And these regulations were designed to conserve fabric and materials for the war effort. The rules limited or discouraged excessive fabric use, wide hems, extra pleats, unnecessary ornamentation, multiple pockets, and certain decorative features. And so as a result, women's clothing during the war years often became simpler and more streamlined. This practical simplicity matched the existing purpose of the house dress extremely well. Now, the idea of the house dress isn't new. It was around previously as well. And something you may have heard of is the use of feed sacks. So wartime thrift and earlier Depression-era habits encouraged the reuse of fabric whenever possible. And one well-documented example was the reuse of flour sacks, feed sacks, and other cloth commodity bags. Farm families, especially women, transformed these materials into dresses, aprons, skirts, quilts, towels, and children's clothing. And so during the Great Depression, manufacturers welcomed this practice and began producing sacks with colorful printed patterns. specifically intended to appeal to homemakers and home sewers. And this actually continued through World War II. Now, some women preferred matching prints when making larger garments, and that required multiple sacks. And I'd like to say these sacks were not very large. I have one here, and it's about 1 yard of fabric. So this is feed sack material, and I have two. So I have 2 yards of this material, and it's not as wide as fabric you would buy these days. So I have several patterns of house dresses, and they take about 3 to 4 yards, and that's the safe estimate to make a house dress. So you would need about 4 feed sacks or flour sacks to make a dress, especially one that had the same pattern. I think that of all the house dress patterns that I have from the era, the least amount of fabric I have seen to be able to be used is 3 yards. And of course, some women wanted to match the prints. So the other great thing about the house dress is its durability. So clothing in the 1940s was generally expected to last longer than much of the modern clothing that we see today. And so garments were repeatedly repaired, patched, altered, handed down, and remade into other items when worn out. And that was especially true during the wartime shortages and rationing. The house dress existed with a broader make do and mend culture where practicality and conservation were considered normal parts of everyday life. I am the fortunate owner of several house dresses from the era, and I can say that all the dresses have some sort of mending, one more than the others, and that's because that house dress was from the 1930s. And that house dress specifically, I have mismatched buttons. There are a lot of mended repairs on this dress, but she's still hanging on strong. So, why did the house dress matter historically? Well, it's historically significant not because it was glamorous, but because it represented ordinary daily labor. And it was worn during the wartime shortages and rationing, domestic work, and the maintenance of everyday family life on the American home front. So while military uniforms and factory workwear became iconic symbols of the war era, the house dress reflected the less visible labor that kept households functioning. And it was not designed to stand out, though a lot of them are pretty cute. It was designed to work. And maybe that's exactly why it tells us so much about ordinary life during the war years. I mean, the women wearing these house dresses, they were rarely trying to make history. They were trying to finish the laundry, stretch ration coupons, feed their families, and get through another long day. But that ordinary work is part of the history, too. There is some confusion between a house dress and a day dress. They are actually two different things. Now, even though I'm focusing on the house dress, I want to give you a little insight on the differences of a house dress and a day dress. So, a day dress, on the other hand, was broader and more socially presentable. And a woman could wear a day dress shopping downtown, to lunch, to church, to office work, social calls, and daytime events. And day dresses tended to be more tailored. They were more fashionable. They could be accessorized with hats, gloves, handbags, and heels. They were made with better fabrics and more careful detailing. And so in the 1940s, day dress essentially meant general daytime public wear. To put it more in practical terms, house dress, domestic wear, a day dress, public daytime wear. A house dress was utility focused. A day dress was style focused. A house dress was washable cotton prints, and a day dress had better fabrics and tailoring. The house dress was often worn with an apron, and the day dress was often worn with accessories. The house dress was for chores and home life, and the day dress was for shopping, work, and visiting. Now, even though I broke that down a little bit, wartime rationing during World War II, it did blur the distinction somewhat. Many women wore simpler dresses, and some nicer house dresses could pass for casual public wear. Claire McArdle's famous 1942 popover dress is a perfect example. It functioned as both a house dress and a fashionable casual dress. Now, in the 1940s and the 1950s, women were generally expected to change clothes for different parts of the day. You might have seen that in some of the Hollywood movies from the time. So, a woman might wear a house dress in the morning, a nicer day dress for errands or lunch, and a separate evening dress later. And that rhythm of dressing largely disappeared after the 1960s. So, when did the house dress go out of style? Well, the decline began in the early to mid 1960s. House dresses remained extremely common through the 1950s. Television sitcoms like I Love Lucy helped cement the image of the American housewife in a shirtwaist or a house dress. But several cultural shifts changed the house dress to fade. By the 1960s, increasing numbers of women worked outside the home, so it reduced the need of a specialized at-home uniform. Also, casual sportswear took over. Slacks, capri pants, pedal pushers, blouses, knitwear became more socially acceptable for women. And the mid-1960s fashion revolution emphasized youthful styles, mini skirts, tights, sleek shifts, and modern silhouettes. So the old fashioned house dress suddenly looked tied to an older generation and to traditional domestic roles. It was symbolically connected to the 1950s ideal of the stay at home housewife. As women's liberation movements grew in the late 1960s and 1970s, many women rejected clothing associated with domestic confinement. So, the timeline for the house dress, roughly, is 1920s through 1950s. It really reached its peak popularity. But by the early 1960s, we really started to see it decline. And by the late 1960s through the 1970s, it largely disappears from the mainstream American fashion. And by the 1970s, women were much more likely to wear pants, jeans, casual separates, caftans, leisure wear, instead of a domestic house dress. But the garment itself, it never really fully vanished. It evolved into the duster, the muumuu, the casual lounge dresses, and even those modern house dresses that resurfaced during COVID lockdowns. So it wasn't that people stopped wearing house dresses, it's that they stopped being an important part of everyday culture, and they evolved as society and culture evolved. Looking back at the wartime 1940s, maybe the house dress wasn't as photographed because it symbolized an ordinary moment, an ordinary day. But looking back now, maybe it's those ordinary moments that mattered most. I hope you enjoyed this episode of On the Victory Homefront. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and share it with your friends and family. And until next time, my friends, remember, victory is in the everyday.